with y'all's score from yesterday and the progress check. I remember those progress checks, the progress check that you completed yesterday, that acts as like our first exam, right? You might be thinking, wow, that was pretty easy. Well, the first unit is pretty easy, right? It's just basic ecosystem, biogeochemical cycles. We will later introduce the free response questions, the short essay questions, which will be a little more challenging because you'll have to actually synthesize your answer rather than just selecting it from a multiple choice question bank. So let's take a look at our checklist for today. Make sure we know what we need to get done. All right, so I am going to go over y'all's progress check from yesterday. And then I'm going to introduce our new unit, Unit 2 on biodiversity. I'm going to go over the first 9 slides. And then today or tonight, you need to read Chapter 8, or these pages right here. It's in Chapter 8, pages 145 through 147. And then there's a separate document, Bottlenecks and Founder Effects, that you can find in the library. You need to read this as well. It's just a PDF. I think it's only 1 page, really, really short. You can see it right there. But be sure to read that, especially if you have not had biology. Even if you had biology, I would still take a look at it because I didn't really go into detail with bottleneck effect because it's something that's kind of more important in an environmental science class when considering population size, genetic diversity for conservation. And then you've got 2 TQs, 2.1 and 2.2. Those are due tonight. So let's go ahead and start by taking a look at y'all's progress checks that you completed yesterday. And again, I was very, very pleased. Let's see here, results. And you can see that it's amazing, right? You know, out of y'all's second period, 24 y'all are scored in the green, which I think green is like, if I remember correctly, like 75% and above or 80% and above. So that's fantastic. I am still very troubled. And these 4 individuals, I don't know what the story is, but missing an exam, I can't think of a single thing that would cause someone to fail faster than getting a 0 for an exam. I mean, if you forget last minute, you're like, oh my goodness, how could I forget? And it's 11:30, just randomly guess. Guessing is better than get slammed with a 0. So I'll be talking to these individuals about potentially dropping the course or bumping down to maybe an honors earth and environmental if this is too much to keep up with. All right, let's take a look at some of the commonly missed questions so we can make sure not to miss them again. All right, so I'm only going to stop if I see, 4 or more students. And you can see that, I mean, it's great, when you've got a majority of the students getting the correct answer. There's no real issues. Yeah, and guys, I'm really impressed with this. All right, here we go. Here we get something. Amount of oxygen consumed. Okay. The rate of reaction can be measured in the dark by determining the amount of oxygen gas consumed over a period of time. Okay. Now, we've talked a lot about photosynthesis and cell respiration. Photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide and fixes it into carbohydrates and produces oxygen, whereas cellular respiration is the way in which we break down carbohydrates in the presence of oxygen. So cellular respiration would be the only answer that would be consuming oxygen. These 3 up here, primary productivity, gross primary productivity, and net primary productivity, we're more concerned with photosynthesis. We're more concerned with carbon dioxide being consumed and oxygen being produced, right? So cellular respiration is the way in which we break down carbohydrates in the presence of oxygen to produce ATP, or energy for our cells. We call that aerobic respiration. But other than that, I didn't see any issues, right? And so let's see here. I think this one was one that a number of students in my other class missed. The energy available to consumers is determined by subtracting the energy used by plants from the total energy transformed. So if we consider how much energy is actually transformed or fixed or stored by photosynthesis, that's gross primary productivity. However, the plant made those carbohydrates with the intention of using some of them for energy. And so we need to take gross primary productivity and we need to subtract cellular respiration, right? How much energy was broken down by that plant for growing, protein synthesis, et cetera, et cetera. And what's left over, what is actually stored, right, that's available to the consumers would be the net primary productivity. So GPP minus R, respiration, equals NPP, or net primary productivity. Let's see if there was any other ones. long-term effects of no-till agriculture. We're going to talk a lot more about agricultural practices later on, but looking at this diagram, okay, you can see that we're looking at what could potentially be the phosphorus cycle, right? Because it says right here, phosphate and rock dissolve phosphates, right? And so we've talked a lot about how phosphorus is kind of a slow cycle. There's not an atmospheric component. It doesn't dissolve in water very well, and it's like the #1 limiting factor, right? So most organisms, most plant communities or photosynthetic phytoplankton, they're just hanging out waiting for phosphorus. So farmers in a suburban coastal town started using no-till agriculture, a practice that reduces soil erosion from the farmland. Use the image above to determine which of the following long-term effects would occur. Well, if you look up here, okay, farmland was contributing to a lot of runoff, a lot of waste, right, and soil erosion. So if there's a lot of soil erosion, a lot of waste, there's going to be a lot of phosphorus, right? And so what happens when you get excess phosphorus in the nearby ocean or the nearby body of water? You're going to have a lot of cultural eutrophication. You're going to experience quite a few algal blooms. But since they are no longer, right, using tilling practices, right, no-till, they've reduced soil erosion. So there's less runoff, there's less waste, right, less fertilizer ending up in the water, and so we would see a decrease in algal growth. So that's the correct answer right there. All right, let's see here. Let's go ahead and get started for our lesson. Here it is. Scroll up. And, you know, when I'm going over these slides, you know, you can take old school notes, paper and pencil, or a Google Doc, or you can make a copy of this Google slide for yourself, and you could actually type in the speaker notes below, right? So as I'm saying things or describing things or giving examples, or if I say, hey, you really need to know this, that's a good place to type in your notes. That way they actually go per slide, right? So you know exactly what you've written down and which slide it goes with. So we're going to talk about biodiversity, and the first thing I want to do is I want to address a common misconception. When people tend to think about biodiversity, they tend to only think about one thing. How many different species are there, right? So they'd say the tropical rainforest is very biodiverse. There are lots of species there. Someone might say the bird or avian biodiversity of Costa Rica is unreal because there are hundreds of species of birds. However, that is a fairly incomplete picture of biodiversity. There are other aspects and attributes of an ecosystem that contribute to biodiversity that are not directly related to the sole number of species, right? So we're going to add some layers to this definition, and biodiversity is really important, okay? And biodiversity is a product of geological history, you know, changes in climate, both natural and anthropogenic, and natural selection. Now, we could kind of break biodiversity into 3 main categories, right? The first consideration would be ecosystem diversity, right? So when you're thinking about different biomes, each biome has a unique set of climatic conditions, different temperatures and different amounts of precipitation. And the climates, the temperature and precipitation, the diversity of climates produces a diversity in the flora and fauna, right? The biota, the biological communities that are found in those biomes. And we can even go one step further, right? And we can look at each biome, right? We can go and study a boreal forest. And within that boreal forest, right, we can find ecological diversity within that forest. In other words, different ecosystem conditions, right? If you're at the top of the trees in the boreal forest, there's a whole different range of conditions than you would find at the understory, down near the layer of leaf litter and soil. Different conditions, right? And that variation in conditions within that ecosystem diversity is going to contribute to the overall diversity of those biological communities. And that's when we get to species diversity, right? We can look at the total number of species living in a particular ecosystem in a biome, right? And if we were to simply count up the number of species here, both animals and plants and fungi, that total number is known as species richness, right? So I might say or give you a table, like what is the species richness for this sample or survey? And you would simply count the number of species. That isn't necessarily going to indicate directly that this area is in fact biodiverse, but it can be a useful tool when comparing two ecosystems for conservation purposes or for protection purposes as well. But there is another consideration, right? Because we need to consider the diversity of each species itself. We need to look at the population. We need to look at the population and, you know, what are the age demographics? What is the male to female sex ratio? but more importantly, what is the genetic diversity? Okay, and genetic diversity is the total number of variants of genes, not just the total number of genes, right? Because you could look at two organisms, right, and say, okay, in this particular population, this particular species, has 2,000 genes. That doesn't necessarily mean that the population in general is diverse, because each of those individuals would have that same number of genes belonging to the same species. The important thing about genetic diversity is how many different variations are there to each gene, right? So if you were studying, a population of moose, you might look at, are there variations in fur color? And those variations in fur color are going to be the result of variations in that fur gene. Every single one of those moose would have the same gene for hair or fur, but the variations that would exist are going to result in variations in their fur color. Populations that have more variations tend to have more opportunities for natural selection to occur or evolution. Now, first thing we need to look at is, again, the ecosystem diversity, and that really comes down to what kind of habitats are present there. And we can consider the habitat diversity of a particular ecosystem or a biome, okay? And so, maybe this is the habitat structure of Western North Carolina, okay? And you can see that as a result of the unique climate of Western North Carolina, the temperature and precipitation, we have a unique collection of plants and animals. And you have to remember that plants, right, have good adaptations for their climate, and the plants result in the adaptations of the animals, right? So the kinds of plants that you have usually determines what kind of animals. Now, the different plants here represent different, different structures, different structural diversity. So not only do these different plants, these different trees and grasses, not only could they potentially produce different foods, right? Some of these trees might make flowers, some might make acorns or small fruits, some might make berries, some might make tender little shoots, maybe it's the roots, maybe it's the bark. They're going to produce a lot of food for these different animals, but they're also providing habitat structure. Like, where are these organisms going to fulfill their ecological role? Where are they going to live, more or less? And you can see that these larger trees provide a lot of vertical stratification. And with this vertical stratification, you get variations in conditions, right? Obviously, it's going to be much warmer and sunnier up here, maybe even a little drier. And as you go further down, into the understory, it's going to be a little cooler, maybe a little bit more humid, and obviously a little darker, okay? And so those differences in conditions provide opportunities for different adaptations, right? For different niches to be exploited by these different organisms. And you can see that if we move further out this way, right, where we don't have all these large coniferous and deciduous trees, and we're down here with the shrubs and the grasses, there's going to be little or less variation in conditions, right? Out here on the grass and the ground cover, right, it's all going to be relatively hot, relatively dry, right? So the conditions is going to be more uniform, right? So it's less structural diversity. Now, if you have all of these, right, kind of mixed together, right? So you got some trees, maybe in a clump, and then a patch of grass, and then maybe like a swamp or a small pond in that same small geographical area. Now we're talking lots of habitat diversity, lots of structural diversity that can allow for different niches to be exploited without having a lot of overlap between the different species, right? And here I've just got a list of various birds, right, and their habitats, where they like to hang out, right? And so when you go into the woods and you're looking for these particular organisms, right, you know where to look, right, with your binoculars. And this is spatial partitioning, right? So they have spatially separated themselves so they're not in direct competition with one another. Species diversity would be simply like species richness, right? So how many species are present? And so here we've got two examples. We've got community number 1 and community number 2. And I've got the species labeled, right? This dark green deciduous looking tree is A, B, C, and D, okay? And you can see them present in community 2 as well. Now, let me ask you a question, and you can answer out loud or you can answer in the chat. Which of these two communities is more biodiverse? And consider what I was just talking about on the last slide. Everyone right now in the chat, which of these do you think is more biodiverse? Number 1 or number 2? Well, Looks like all of you guys got it right. Community 1 is, in fact, more biodiverse than Community 2. But if we went with our old school misconception of biodiversity, if we only counted the number of species, these two communities have the same species richness, right? If I said, okay, how many species are there? And you counted 1, 2, 3, 4. The species richness of Community 1 would be 4. If you counted it for Community 2, I see 1, 2, 3, 4 different species. If that was the only thing we took into consideration, then these two communities would be of equal diversity, right? They have the same equal species richness. And you know by just looking at this, it's like, no, I think Community 1 is more biodiverse than Community 2. Can anyone tell me why Community 1 is more biodiverse than Community 2, despite having the same number of species? You can type it in the chat or, come on, y'all need to get chatty, man. Okay, I like Jessica's answer. Madison, good too. So Madison, there's more of a variation of species. And a really good way, I know what you're saying. If you wanted to be really, really descriptive, you could say that the abundance or the proportion of these species is more equal, right? And so, yes, there's 4 species, but their population sizes are more proportional, right? They're more equal than, say, Community 2. I like Jessica's answer. She said in Community 1, there's more exposed ground area, right? And I think she's onto something here, right? Because she's talking about the fact that if you look at Community 1 and you look at Community 2, Community 1 would probably have more habitat diversity, right? You're going to have, the canopy, you're going to have the mid-story and the understory, and you're also going to have some open grassland, whereas you might not have as much of that here, right? You can see there's definitely more shade in Community 2 than Community 1. What else? You guys are a snooze fest. All right. Since there are a more even distribution of population, right? So if you look at this like light green tree, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. And you look down here, there's only 1. If you were to compare the genetic diversity of these two communities, would you not agree there's probably more variations of the genes in species B in Community 1 than there is in Community 2? Community 2, this particular species, if there's the last tree, this tree might not even be able to reproduce, sexually at least. It might be able to use asexual reproduction. And even if it does be able to be self-fertile, in other words, sexually reproduce with itself, the variants that are the result of that are not going to be much different than the parent plant. Whereas here, these plants have a greater degree of opportunity for sexual reproduction, which is going to increase genetic variation over time. And again, more habitat diversity. Now we can look at species, the species themselves and their ecological roles, and we can discuss the diversity of the niches, the niche, or roles in which these organisms perform for their ecosystems. We can kind of split it into 2 categories, and it's a spectrum, right? So animals are not just one or the other. On one extreme, you have what are known as generalists, right? A raccoon is a good example of a generalist. These organisms can inhabit a relatively broad niche. They can tolerate a wide range of conditions. If we were to go back to that first diagram with the habitat diversity, with the trees, the shrubs, and the ground cover, that raccoon could probably get by in any of those habitats, right? The raccoon can also consume a lot of different sources of food, right? Kind of being an omnivore, an opportunistic feeder. The panda and the koala, these are on the other side of the extreme, right? These guys are specialists. They have a very narrow niche, a very narrow, highly specialized ecological role. And they also have a more narrow range of tolerance for their conditions. And they probably have a stronger preference for a particular source of food and nutrition. I mean, pandas are famous for feeding, almost solely on bamboo. They have adaptations that allow them to get enough nutrition from that bamboo to support this relatively large mass that most other animals probably don't have the ability to do. And so it's not going to have a lot of competition feeding in those bamboo forests. However, no bamboo, no panda. The same can be said with the koala. Koala kind of having a special digestive preference for eucalyptus, which is surprising because eucalyptus is slightly toxic to other organisms, right? You do need to familiarize yourself with these 2 differences. Generalists are more likely to survive significant disturbances than specialists. Specialists do really well in stable, constant environments. You're going to find a lot of specialists in the tropical rainforest. Those tropical rainforests have been around for millions of years. You're going to find a lot of generalists in dynamic ecosystems, places that have like, frequent disturbances like wildfires. There's a lot of generalist species in the American prairie or in places like the chaparral ecosystem because there's so frequent fires. And the reason for these specialties or this generalist approach is, again, they're trying to avoid direct competition with each other because of the competitive exclusion principle. You don't want to be in direct competition over resources. And so the separation of their ecological roles ensures that both of these organisms can get enough nutrition to survive and won't necessarily be bothered by the other. We also have various titles that we use to describe the ecological roles of different species. Some of these titles and descriptions are more important for like conservation efforts or just discussions of environmental health and environmental quality. The first one I want to talk about are keystone species. Keystone species are like the foundation of their ecosystems. They are far more important than their population would lead you to believe, because sometimes there's not a lot of keystone species, but if you were to remove them, you could see a trophic cascade, right? A good example of a keystone species is a sea otter. So sea otters live in marine ecosystems, and they like to eat sea urchins, these little purple spike balls, right? And because of these defensive adaptations that the sea urchins have, there are not a lot of predators that feed on them other than the sea otters, right? Obviously having adaptations that allow them to predate on the sea urchins without being hurt. Now, the sea otters control the urchin populations. Fishermen were bothered by the sea otters. They were getting in the nets, they were chewing through the nets, they were resulting in a decrease in fish caught per day of work. And so a lot of the fishermen killed the sea otters. Well, what they thought was going to happen is if you kill the sea otters, there's going to be more fish. But what they noticed is after removing the sea otters, the population of fish declined. They decreased drastically. Now, why was that? Well, because the sea otter is a keystone species in a kelp forest. So kelp are large marine algae. You've probably seen them before in nature documentaries. They're long, like continuous strands of algae. They kind of look like long blades of grass in the ocean. And these things are huge. They're like 10 meters long sometimes, they're just 30 feet. And the kelp are the foundation, right, keystone of a kelp forest. Well, what ensures the health of the population? Well, that would be the sea urchins, right? But again, if the sea urchin populations don't have their population kept in check, then they might overconsume the kelp. And no kelp forest, no ecosystem or habitat diversity for the fish. So the fishermen killed the sea otters, the sea urchin population exploded, right? And they overexploited this opportunity to feed on the kelp with no predators, no predator pressure, and the kelp forest decreased. And that resulted in an overall decrease of habitat diversity and then again, species diversity. So they're keystone species. Beavers are keystone species. They're habitat engineers, right? Beavers create dams so they can turn streams and rivers into wetlands, into lakes, into ponds. And going from moving water to standing water, you're definitely going to change a lot of conditions, and you're going to provide a lot more habitat diversity for other species, right? So without the beaver, no dam, no pond, right? And so they are keystone species. African elephants and other elephant species are keystone species. They actually create a lot of habitat diversity by knocking over trees, right? So in a heavily forested areas where the elephants travel back and forth between water, sources of food, they trample and knock down a lot of vegetation and create a diverse habitat, right? Obviously around watering holes, stopping down the vegetation. So kind of opening up the forest a little bit. And then along the border of the forests and the savanna, they're knocking down trees and kind of creating opportunities for the savanna to kind of maintain its boundary. There are lots of different keystone species. Corals are keystone species. They create the reefs. Very important. Indicator species are used by environmental biologists and environmental scientists to monitor changes in environments. These organisms tend to respond to changes more quickly than others. The first one we'll talk about is lichen and mosses. So lichen is like that crusty stuff that grows in the side of trees and rocks. Lichen is actually a fungus that has a mutualistic symbiotic relationship with algae that live inside. So the lichen is a fungus and algae living together. Now the fungus actually has the ability to secrete enzymes that are strong enough to break down rock. That's kind of crazy. And as the lichens secrete these enzymes, they break down the rock and they absorb the minerals. They also absorb water from the air. And with the water and the minerals, they can provide that to the algae, which will photosynthesize sugars and feed the fungi. However, if the air quality changes, the lichen will struggle because the chemical makeup of their tissues are usually pretty similar to the ambient air concentration. So if there are heavy metals present in the air, maybe because a new coal burning power plant was constructed, those heavy metals are going to be assimilated and absorbed by the lichen, right? Because they're getting their water from the air because they don't have roots per se, and they could accumulate the heavy metals, and that could compromise their tissues. So if you notice a decrease in lichen, and that could tell us quite a bit about a change in air quality, maybe the presence of heavy metals, or maybe the presence of various compounds that are forming acid rains. Amphibians are another good indicator species. Amphibians are great indicator species of water quality. Most amphibians lay their eggs in water, right? They need water to lay their eggs. And if there are significant changes in water quality, the changes in water quality, maybe temperature, pH, could compromise the development of the eggs, or it could compromise the metamorphic development of the tadpole. Because remember, amphibians lay eggs in water, then it becomes like a tadpole. They lose their gills and develop lungs, and then they're terrestrial, right? But they still need to return to water for breeding purposes. So if you notice a decrease in amphibian population, that could tell you something about the water. Could you imagine going camping or exploring a swamp or a wetland in South Florida and not hearing any frogs at night? That would tell you that something is wrong. Unfortunately, amphibian populations are decreasing worldwide because there's been a worldwide decrease in water quality. Later on, we'll talk about how various pharmaceuticals are ending up in water, and it's actually causing a lot of problems for the frogs and actually inhibiting their ability to become either male or female. A lot of them are kind of getting stuck in this hermaphroditic state, which leaves them unable to breed because of various compounds in their environment. Birds are another great indicator species because if the going gets tough, a lot of times they'll just migrate elsewhere, right? They'll change their migratory patterns. And so if you notice that one decade there's all these birds, and the next decade they're just not showing up anymore, that could tell you that there's something changing, right? It could be climactic. It could be something to do with their prey, or an increase in predator population. Birds also make great indicator species because a lot of them are like higher up on the trophic levels, right? If you're thinking about eagles, owls, and hawks, and they can suffer from what is known as bioaccumulation and magnification, which are two things we'll talk about later. Birds also are warm-blooded, so they need to eat a lot. I read somewhere that birds lose on average 10% of their body weight every night. So I'm a 200-pound person. That would be like me losing 20 pounds every time I fell asleep, right? And so these birds need to eat a lot. And so if their source of food has become compromised, you can imagine how quickly that could decrease their likelihood of surviving. Or maybe their food is laden with some kind of pesticide or chemical. And if they're eating like that every single day, those toxins could accumulate inside of their bodies. Pioneering species are species that establish new populations or new ecosystems. Lichen and mosses are good examples of pioneering species. As I mentioned before, the lichen has the ability to turn rock into soil, which could then provide, habitat diversity for seeds or other plants. Birds are also good pioneering species because they can migrate and land on islands and develop populations, right? So if you think about like a volcano, like bubbling up out of the ocean and then lying dormant, right? So it's no longer an active volcano. Well, right now it's just barren igneous rock, right? And so lichen and mosses can colonize and pioneer this island, slowly breaking it down over time. And they themselves will go through life cycles and die and decompose, creating soil. And then a bird lands, take a break, drop some guano, excretes some waste, and maybe there's some seeds in there. The seeds start growing, and then the bird comes back to eat, and you can see how they are pioneering new populations. Generalist species, as I pointed out earlier, are like raccoons, right? Humans are a good example of generalist species. They have a wide range of tolerance for conditions and kind of make do with lots of different changes in their ecosystems. Specialists, like I had pointed out with the koala, these organisms have a very, very specific ecological role, and they generally have a very narrow range of tolerance. In very stable, unchanging ecosystems, these guys reign supreme, right? Because they don't have a lot of competition with other species. There might be a lot of competition within their species, but not so much with others. Whereas generalists, right, they're a little bit more adaptable to change. So like common disturbances or frequent disturbances don't bother the generalists so much. And then you've got endemic. Endemic are organisms that are kind of unique to an area. You might say like koala would be an endemic species of Australia. You might talk about, various birds of paradise, tropical birds in the islands of Indonesia. Those would be endemic to Indonesia, which means you don't find any natural breeding populations anywhere else in the world than this area. And endemic populations are an important consideration because their adaptations and their behavioral adaptations in regards to competition are very unique to the organisms that are present in their isolated areas. Endemic populations can exist in places other than like the traditional definition of an island, right? So in the Rocky Mountains, obviously there'd be some endemic species probably only found there. Same could be said about the mountains of the southern Appalachian area. That's all going to have endemic species that you're not going to find anywhere else. Invasive species are species that have been introduced to non-native areas. So the lionfish is a good example of an invasive species that was brought from the Indochina Sea to the Americas for the exotic pet trade, and somehow and unfortunately they got out, either released intentionally or accidentally. And since they have these incredible adaptations, right? These like spines are like hypodermic needles with really potent toxin. Their predators in the Indochina Sea have adapted to that toxin, right? So there are predators in the Indochina Sea that eat the lionfish. There are competitors for the lionfish because they had been in competition with each other for the last, 100,000 years as they were evolving these adaptations. But when you introduce the lionfish to a new ecosystem, to a non-native ecosystem like the Caribbean or the South Florida Keys, there are no predators that have adaptations. So the lionfish are growing out of control. Their populations have exploded and they are decimating the marine fishery populations in the Caribbean and South Florida, which could really hurt jobs, both for like commercial fisheries as well as tourism. Because when you go to coral reefs now in the Caribbean and in South Florida, you're going to see lionfish. You're going to see a lot of them, right? So they're drastically decreasing the diversity. These guys are voracious feeders and they breed like crazy, up to like 200,000 eggs a year, I think. Other examples of invasive. What was that?
Can I talk about like what we've been doing to counteract that?
Yes, please, Troy. Let me hear it.
Due to their, increase in destroying the ecosystem, a lot of like divers and like fishers and stuff like that have taken to just specifically targeting them and cooking them and eating them as a main food source.
No, Troy, are you a scuba diver or a fisherman?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
Well, I was gonna say when I was working in the Keys, that was actually like my favorite hobby. Like if I had a day off, I went spearfishing only for the lionfish, and I would kill 10, 15, 20 of them a day. And yes, you can cook them. In fact, in the Florida Keys, some of the restaurants, as you would point out, have tried to kind of create a market for like a lionfish sandwich. When I used to cook it and serve it to my students, I would remove the spines and bake the fish, bake the fillets, and then I would use the spines as like little serving toothpicks. And the students were like, "What? I'm not going to eat that." But the heat denatures the toxin. So you're absolutely right. There's a lot of things we can do. Lionfish derbies, like you're saying, almost making it like a competition. And it's really important, right? Because we created the problem and we're responsible for solving it. Another really crazy example of invasive species, and Troy, you might also know about this, are the Burmese pythons. Anyone know about Burmese pythons and where they might be a major problem?
Florida.
Yeah, poor Florida, right? Yeah, so in the Everglades in South Florida, right? People released their Burmese pythons. Maybe they got too big as a pet and they're like, I don't want to hurt it. I don't want to kill it. So I'll release it in nature. Guys, if you buy pets in the pet store and you don't want them anymore, find a rehabilitation place, find someone else who wants it. Do not release them into nature. That's like the absolute worst thing you do. Because now we have a breeding population of Burmese pythons in the Florida Everglades. And as if the American alligators weren't scary enough, now you've got these massive boa constrictors hunting you at night. And the problem is a lot of the animals in the Everglades have a lot of adaptations that make it hard for the American alligator to predate on them. But they don't have those behavioral adaptations. They don't have those morphological adaptations or sensory adaptations to allow them to to negate the pressure of the Burmese python. So the Burmese python is outcompeting the American alligator, which is crazy, and it's decimating a lot of the small mammal and bird populations down there. Kudzu is another plant, right, that is causing a lot of problems in the South. It's considered the plant that ate the South. We'll talk more about kudzu later. Genetic diversity, again, guys, is probably one of the single most important attributes of biodiversity, right? And so genetic diversity, right? So all birds have genes for their beaks, but not all birds have the same variant or the same version of those genes. And the different versions of genes we call different genotypes, right? Or alleles. So these birds all have genes for beak shape and structure, but they have different variations, different mutations of that gene. And the genetic diversity results in the morphological diversity. We are who we are mostly because of our DNA, because of our genes, right? And since there was genetic variation in the finch population, they were able to colonize the different islands of the Galapagos, right? And to exploit new opportunities because of these variations. Genetic variation is really important for natural selection. For natural selection or evolution to occur, you have to have a population. The population needs to have genetic variation, and organisms that don't have the good variations need to die, and the organisms that do have the good variations survive because of their mutation are more likely to have offspring, and they're more likely to pass on their genes to the next generation. So genetic diversity is good. It gives populations adaptability. However, this can kind of play out in really odd ways. So this is the American bison, right? And here's the population prior to 1492. We're talking like 60 million bison. I don't know if you guys have ever been out west. I don't know if you guys have ever actually seen a buffalo or a bison. These things are massive. They are majestic, and they are a symbol of our country and our continent. And we almost brought them to extinction, right? Because of unregulated hunting and poor hunting practices and a very inefficient use of this animal. The Native Americans had it figured out, right? But when the settlers came, right, they exploited these resources very ineffectively, and they drastically reduced the population. So by 1890, right, there was only 750 left, right? And they are recovering. Okay, so now the population has bounced back up to about 360,000, still a tiny fraction of a fraction of a fraction of what it once was. They were very, very close to extinction. And as a result of, developing the national park system and our country taking a little bit more care of the environment, their population has been able to recover. However, it will never be the same. And let me explain why. Because this initial bison population had been adapting and evolving in North America for thousands of years. There was probably a whole lot of genetic diversity within this initial breeding population, lots of different variations for genes. So there was probably a lot of adaptations that really suited the buffalo for the American prairie. After we had brought their population to almost extinction and there were only 750 left, they have been able to recover. But what problem could result from this recovering population having originated from only a starting population of 750?
Genetic deformities due to incest.
Yeah, Troy, it's wild. For these bison to recover, cousins would have had to have mated with cousins, right? And as a result of such a small population, there would be a very, very small range of genes. And we all know it's not good for sons and daughters to breed with mothers and fathers or sisters and brothers and cousins together. We know that can lead to genetic deformities. And really what Troy was getting at is when you reduce the population, we call this the bottleneck effect. Like if you think about a Coca-Cola bottle gets narrow at the top, we have limited the number of individuals that have survived, and we suffer from what is known as the founder effect, which means that since it was such a small population to begin with, there was not a lot of variation. And so what we're seeing now in the recovering American bison population is a lot of genetic deformities and an increase in recessive genetic disorders as a result of incestuous relationships. And the reason they name it the founder effect is if you think about any settlers, right? So if you think about, all the pilgrims sailing over in the Mayflower and trying to establish a community, after a couple of generations, they were all cousins, right? And so you can imagine these small isolated populations of even human beings. the increased rate and frequencies of genetic disorders. You want genetic diversity. You don't want small founding populations. And we see this a lot in conservation efforts when trying to help small populations of endangered and threatened animals. Helping them recover can be really, really challenging. And we'll talk about some ways in which geneticists are trying to resolve that issue. And last but not least, all of the habitat diversity that leads to the species diversity that's a result of the genetic diversity results in a diversity of services that ecosystems provide, the ecosystem itself, but also us as human beings. Because an environmental science class is about conserving and understanding the environment. But more importantly, it's about saving and conserving our way of life. Guys, there is nothing humans could do to destroy life as we know it for nature, right? Asteroids have hit, all kinds of cataclysmic events causing mass extinctions, and life finds a way, to quote Dr. Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park. However, will we be there along that change? Will we be there? Will we be able to sustain our life? I mean, most of our calories for the human population come from rice, wheat, and corn. What if the climate changes and those three plants don't grow as well, right? You're talking about like 50% of the world's calories come from 3 plants, right? We need the ecosystems for these services, because without them, these services are very, very hard to do from like an engineering standpoint, right? You'll notice I do like making fun of engineers. I make fun of engineers all the time, because an engineer builds something and they're like, haha, look what I've done. It's like, dude, you just copied that from nature. Nature has all the answers, right? And a lot of times what we have to go above and beyond to create with engineering, if we would have just kind of followed the path of nature to begin with, we wouldn't have had to do that in the first place, right? If you think about water quality, we have all these facilities and these machines to clean our water, and nature can do this just fine if left alone and preserved. So what you need to be able to do over the course of the semester is, anytime we're talking about an ecosystem, you need to be able to think, okay, what does this ecosystem provide for itself, for kind of the global biosphere and human populations? For example, tropical rainforests obviously are going to produce a lot of varieties of foods for both the local population, the indigenous people, but also the international kind of food market. Most of the foods that we eat didn't necessarily originate in our backyards, right? They're from all over the world, and they've been cultivated. Raw materials, right? There are lots of types of woods that only grow in tropical forests, and they can be harvested sustainably to produce unique wood products. A lot of medicinal resources and medications actually come from the various species you find in tropical rainforests. And believe it or not, the massive hardwoods in the tropical rainforest, they have a significant contribution to freshwater distribution. In fact, they can purify water. Most plants, as they pull water up to their roots and it flows up the xylem, a lot of the minerals and dissolved solutes will actually be assimilated or absorbed by the plants. By the time it's released through evapotranspiration, the water's nearly clean. We obviously know that plants like tropical rainforests can contribute to climate regulation by sequestering carbon dioxide and obviously pulling things out of the air and sequestering in other tissues. And it just goes on and on. So over the course of the semester, you need to familiarize yourself with these different services. And that way you'll be able to create a valid, data-driven, fact-based position that'll allow you to argue in favor of conserving the environment. Because it's not until we can actually put money where our mouth is, it's not, to what we can say, tropical rainforest, a hectare of tropical rainforest is worth this much money if it's preserved, that we can actually get people to listen, right? And later on, I'll actually talk to you guys about the value of an individual shark being far more than the value of the fins that would be sold in a fin soup market, okay? Well, that's all I have for you guys. Make sure oh, shoot, didn't mean to do that. Make sure that you check in with your readings tonight, and don't forget about TQ 2.1 and 2.2, and the readings are right here. I strongly suggest that you read these. Very, very, very important as we move forward in our discussion of all things environmental science. Does anyone have any questions before we split? All right, if you do come across any questions or issues, don't hesitate to ask. Shoot me an email or a remind, and I will see you guys tomorrow.